Welcome back from the break. The Qatar Mediation Forum presents the final panel, The Future of Mediation in a Transforming Global System. This session brings together senior figures reflecting on the future trajectory of mediation amid rapid global change. Moderating this panel is Dr. Sarah Hellmuller, who serves as research professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Dr. Chris Coulter and Mr. Martin Griffiths, His Excellency Dr. Majid bin Mohammed Al-Ansari, and Dr. Comfort Iro.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this panel. It is actually my distinct honor to moderate this panel on which we want to discuss the future of mediation. And we have heard it time and again that we live in a new world, whether we call it multipolar, multiplex, or polycentric. And this new world, we have heard and discussed this too, has profound implications for how we think about and how we do mediation. So we want to delve deeper into questions about the future of mediation, and particularly the future of different mediation actors, from the UN to regional organizations to states and NGOs and think tanks, in terms of how they perceive their roles, but also their relationship with each other. We know that multi-party mediation is not new, and that mediation has always been a quote-unquote crowded field. But as the diversity of mediation actors and approaches seems to be increasingly diverse, I think the overarching question for this panel is really, how can a unity of purpose or a common vision be upheld amongst mediators while respecting diversity in approaches, priorities, and objectives? And we have a stellar lineup for this panel with 4 distinguished speakers, and they would need no introduction because they are all very well known. But it is always nice to recall achievements, so I would still like to say a few words. His Excellency, Dr. Majed Al-Ansari, is the advisor to the Prime Minister and official spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar. He founded and heads the Center for International Policy Research and previously was the Director of Policy at the Institute of Social and Economic Survey Research at Qatar University, where he also served as professor. Dr. Chris Coulter is the Executive Director of the Berko Foundation. She has more than 2 decades of experience working on inclusive leadership, mediation, peace processes, and security policy around the world. She held different senior leadership positions at mediation institutions, served as a special advisor on peace and security for the Swedish Foreign Ministry, and also brings a very rich academic background. Dr. Comfort Iro is the Crisis Group President, CEO. It's the Crisis Group's President and CEO. She has almost 3 decades of experience working on or in conflict-affected countries. Work for Crisis Group, she also served as Deputy Africa Program Director for the International Center for Transitional Justice and as Political Affairs Officer and Policy Advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the UN Mission in Liberia. She also sits on various boards and advisory bodies. And Martin Griffith is the Executive Director of the Mediation Group International. He has 50 years of experience working on mediation and humanitarian affairs. He has led mediations on every continent, founded the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, and brings long-standing experience with the UN, most recently as Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. But before that, also as the UN lead mediator of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, UN Special Envoy in Yemen, Senior Advisor to 3 UN Special Envoys for Syria, and Deputy Head of UNSMIS. So you see a really stellar lineup that we have here. So each of the panelists will start with initial remarks about how, from their vantage point, different mediation actors' roles are evolving and what forms of collaboration will be needed in an increasingly fragmented landscape. And after their initial remarks, I will immediately open it up for questions from the audience to make this as interactive as possible. So, Dr. Chris, maybe we can start with you. And please share with us your points, in particular with your experience at Berghof, but also other institutions like the Folke Bernadotte Academy. What is the role of NGOs in particular, but maybe also state actors, given your work with the Swedish Ministry in this new world?
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting us again. This is my first time at the Qatar Mediation Forum. It's been very intensive and super enriching. You mentioned it, the world we live in today, as if it's very different, it's fragmented, is it multipolar, etc. If something is fragmented, what do we do? What would you do if something is fragmented? Well, you try to find clarity, you try to find alliances, you try to clarify what is the problem and who do I need to talk to, who do we need to influence to get things moving. So when an area is fragmented and there's too many actors and no one is leading and we're running around, it's not helpful. So we do need someone, or the plural of someone, to lead something. But the age of sort of a one-man-led mediation or a one-organization-led mediation or one state-led mediation seems in a way to be over. So therefore, how do we work together? How do we find these alliances? It's hard to work together if you're fundamentally different. So you need, in a way, also to get to know each other. What's the strength? What's the leverage of each of these actors? And for small NGOs such as ourselves in Berlin, what's our role? We need to be very clear about what's the limitation of our role, but also where can we contribute? And where can our partners, whether they are governments or others, where do we need them sometimes to use their political leverage? So in a sense, I see think tanks, NGOs, as sometimes bridge builders, that we can sort of bridge this gap. But we also need to be adaptive and flexible without losing track of where we want to go. I see so many opportunities. I'm not afraid of deal making. I really am not. I'm not afraid of deal making. I don't think deal making is mediation. That's a different thing. But let's see that as an opportunity and as a framework for us to then, who actually mediate, to see where we can take processes forward, where we can address root causes. I did mention it in another panel, but a short-term deal doesn't address the root causes. It doesn't address the trauma of a population. It doesn't address whatever the conflict was about. Mediation is basically a political process. It's hard to evade. It is a political process. We need strong governments to lead in these processes, but we are aware that they can't do everything, and one country probably can't do it all. We still need solid analysis. We need feedback loops. We need to test hypotheses. And some things that we can do, the smaller organizations, when things get stuck at the very highest level, where there's a lot of prestige, smaller organizations can actually be more creative. We can offer secure space, we can test things, generate options that you then can filter to maybe a higher track. So I would see that as our probably biggest strength. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So NGOs as bridge builders, deal making as an opportunity, and also NGOs as basically creative thinkers and providers of solutions when things get stuck in other channels. Your Excellency, you bring in the most distinct state perspective on this panel. So how does Qatar see its role amongst other actors? And what is the way forward in terms of upholding the unity of purpose amongst different mediators?
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying, I remember 2 years ago when Dr. Hassan came to me with the idea for the Qatar Media Forum, I was very skeptical. And at the time, like a true bureaucrat, I was against having new forums and new platforms introduced into the mix. But I think, your great work collectively here this year and last year has certainly proven the concept of the need and the viability of having the Qatar Media Forum. So, Qatar Mediation Forum. So we're very keen to see it continue and grow in this platform. Let me say, as the sole representative of a government on, on this panel, I think we need to address, when it comes to mediation, what changed in the who, the what, and the how of mediation. First of all, I hate this notion of the new mediators versus traditional mediators, which kind of usually gives a historical precedent to those who mediated first, without looking into the capacities of mediation and what it means in today's world. But the reality of the situation is that we have a different set of mediators today. Not that those who mediated before have completely been ousted from the process, but their viability within the mediation processes has certainly been downgraded by the current parameters and the current polarizations in the world today. Who are the new incomers into mediation? I think there are two types, if we want to put patterns on it. One is countries in the GCC and the Middle East who were able to start solving our own conflicts first and then built on that capacity to go beyond our borders. So Qatar now, just 2 days ago in this hotel, utilizing one of these backdrops, signed the agreement between the Colombian government and the EGC group in Colombia. But that was a mediation. And this is where I think in the who it's very important. That was a mediation that we were able to bring together as mediators, Qatar, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. This is the new model of mediation. It's bringing in countries, states, that operate not in the same geographical constraints, not in the same topical constraints, but they operate in different parts of the world with different value bases, with different trajectories in their peace facilitation efforts, and they end up being together in the same room doing the mediation, using their collective leverage and their collective capacities in order to produce results. We have seen that happen, for example, in Hamas and Israel, where you have now Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States working together. And we've seen that, we keep seeing that, of course, everywhere, the Quad in Sudan and in all these instances, where we have constellations that don't look similar to the constellations we used to have before. Also within the first question is also who are the people that are doing the mediation. Every time we sit down with the usual suspects when it comes to mediation, there's just like a checklist of why don't you have this group, that group, the other group. Well, the reality of the situation now, the choices of who is mediating is based on the context, not vice versa. In previous mediations, one of the main issues that hampered a lot of peace processes from going forward, at least in the initial stage, was that the people who were working on it, came from totally different contexts and had little understanding of the context beyond the analytical researcher kind of capacity. We need today to have more people that are not shackled by the context, but have an understanding of it that goes beyond the superficial, and that can sit on the table, can speak the language. I'll give you an example of this, because I see a lot of question marks going in up in the room. We look at Afghanistan, for example. When we talk about the women's issues in Afghanistan, it's a grave concern for all of us working on that issue. All of our governments have dictated that the Taliban need to do something about that immediately, and that this will not be accepted in the international community. But we've told our counterparts, leave that to the Muslim countries to have these discussions with the Taliban. We, the Malaysians, other partners from the GCC and beyond, have been able to make very small wins on that issue. The main reason for that was our ability to sit in the room and speak religious doctrine, cultural values, speak on how, and I won't mention it now, but there are a lot of anecdotes on how that worked in this discussion. And now, we're beginning to see very quietly, without a lot of media exposure, some positive steps over there. Now, this is not a total success, but these kind of successes are the ones that make change in society possible. When it comes to the, how we mediate, I think one of the main things that has changed is the dependency on specific state actors to do the mediation, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. But it's the reality of the world today. You talk about mediation here in Qatar, it is solely run by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a small group of people do it within the ministry because it's the nature of the animal today. The international organizations, NGOs, their capacities have been diminished in being part of these processes. But I think it's the part of it's on our part actually, and a bit of self-criticism here. It's our part to go back to empower these international organizations and agencies and empower the NGOs and those who are working in the field to be part of the process and build a comprehensive process that starts with the track one, where our leaders can actually be very helpful in bringing leaders together and bringing opposing sides together, but also go down to the societal level, to the communal level, and to the procedural level of mediation. And finally, when it comes to the why we do mediation, I think the world began this process post-World War II in the sense that there was a newfound understanding of what international peace means. You had the United Nations, you had a world that was coming out of the worst possible military conflict. And then there was a consensus that the only way forward was for conflict to be dealt with through dialogue. We are in a situation now where that system is not only in jeopardy, but aspects of that system that was created have been completely neglected within today's way of dealing with conflict. And therefore, the main reason why we see mediation happening today is firefighting. It's not ending conflict. It's finding a way for the aggressor to kill less people, finding a way for the catastrophe to be a little bit smaller, and finding a way to take that issue off our tables for a couple of months. And this is a very dangerous way of dealing with conflict, and we need to be more comprehensive about it. And again, this is something that not the governments alone can do, but the governments are responsible, the states are responsible to go and find ways of working within the parameters of all the partners and creating these consortiums that are made up of states and non-state, well, non-state actors in the sense that NGOs and so on. And finally, one of the things that I know Martin has worked on that a lot, most of the work that is done now in conflict resolution is not with states. It's with non-state actors in various locales. And non-state actors, we're very close now to mediating between non-state actors without even the state being represented. And the failure of the central state is going to be the face of the new conflict resolution mechanisms that we are going to deal with in the near future.
Thank you very much. Very interesting about this kind of new model of different mediating actors, especially state cooperating and kind of benefiting from their comparative advantages and leverage. And also this role of state actors who have been strengthened in this mediation field, and their role in then also empowering and bringing in the other actors, again, from the UN to civil society and others. Now, over to you, Martin. You have a long career with the UN, but are also the founder, as mentioned, of HT and served as director of EIP. And in a recently published article in The Guardian, you said, and I quote, "Effective mediation in the modern world requires three things: the legitimizing power and global experience of the UN, the leverage of the governments engaged as mediators, and the experience of independent conflict resolution organizations that can bring in the voices of affected communities." Is this how you see the division of tasks in future mediation processes? And can you elaborate a little bit on this?
I was a bit worried. Is that okay? Can you hear me? I was a bit worried when Majid was talking. I thought I was being consigned as a dinosaur. Quite rightly. I mean, he's right. But he rescued me towards the end of his remarks. So thank you very much. I want to say a few words about the UN, and I say this because of that article. I say this because Asif Khan, who should stand up, who is the head of the UN mediation effort, is in the room. So you have to confront, the horrible beast that is with us. I made the point, but it's common knowledge now, isn't it? That the UN political mediation, political diplomacy is largely absent. I agree with Majid. That doesn't mean that mediation is largely absent. I'll come back to that. And I've been struck. We have Chris Lockyer, head of MSF, with us here, a very humanitarian organization, a doctrinal one indeed, who is one of those people, and we've done a lot together, one of many humanitarian organizations which now talk about the need for mediation. Don't leave us alone in the war zone. This didn't used to be the case. And when HD was set up, and there are many people, Katya and others here from HD, we were rescued by Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was one of the founders of HD, who said, all humanitarian aid workers want wars to end. This should not be a surprise. And Chris, you have done great work in the trenches to try to make that happen. But it is largely absent from the UN. It is not largely absent, as you said, Majid, from the world. And I'd like to comment a bit on both of those things. I've joined the United Nations 7 times in my life, and I've left them, I think, 8 times, if my maths is right. I'm still trying to earn a pension. I wouldn't recommend this lifestyle. But I joined them because, of course, I believe in those original ideas, as you said, Majid, from the Charter and the early founders. But I also recognize through my own experience, and I've been both a mediator in the UN and a troubleshooter and a humanitarian, that it ain't the same world today. That's not a bad thing. But I still believe, and Asif will believe this with me, I hope, that the UN is a legitimizer. It's a recorder of agreements. It was fascinating to see some of the recent Security Council meetings on Sudan and Gaza. Weird meetings, of course, but still had sort of potent legitimacy and the need to, mandate the stabilization force for Gaza, for example. The UN is essential. I would like to give an example of this. When I was in OCHA in the UN recently, until last year, I was asked by the Secretary General to run the mediation on the Black Sea grain deal. And a bit of a surprise to me, in fact, because I was doing humanitarian work. But it's partly because it was construed as a humanitarian deal. And that was actually necessary for the parties to give them cover for negotiating with their enemy. But he did that because he saw the Black Sea grain deal as a first step towards a confidence-building measure, not just for global food security, but as a first step. It lasted a year. It was routed by the Russian exit. It came back for a renewed negotiation, as you know, almost completely successful until it was chucked out at the last minute by one of the parties, advised, I think, by their supporters. But what was interesting to me about the UN role in this is the following. We managed to collect, uniquely in my experience with the UN, a whole landscape of different talents in the smallish team, 12, 14, 15 people. We had David Gorman of HD, who was, I think, the beating heart of that team, a remarkable person, and shows that even UN teams, typically opposed to any strangers, could actually benefit from other people coming in. We had experts from the International Maritime Organization, from the World Food Programme, from the Legal Advisors Office, from the Department of Political Affairs. We had this unique breadth of talent that is perhaps the single still most important aspect that the United Nations can bring to these complex deals. It was a deal simply to manage ships crossing the Black Sea, but it was supposed to be and calculated to be a route to peace, tragically not realized. So the UN had a very specific role. It was legitimizing. Turkey obviously played an extraordinary part in this. And indeed, then we look, as Majid has already said, at the broader community. Qatar has played an extraordinary role in Ukraine as well as with Hamas, as well as with the DRC recently, as well as with Venezuela and elsewhere. A remarkable success story, and much more to come. And we rely on you, Majid, to make sure this is the case. So we have seen in the Black Sea grain deal an example of why the UN still has bragging rights. But we also know, Asif, that it's not doing much bragging these days. So is Asif still here, or has he fled crying? His tears are, please be nice to him, as I'm not. But it's absolutely true that the world has shifted. And the world has shifted, Majid said it very well, in two ways, I think. It's very different from the early days of HD, Meredith, we were together, Katya and others, where we ran track one mediations. We did Aceh, we did ETA, we did all sorts of things that don't happen today. It's a complete change. It's back to member states. Their use of leverage, which is creative and necessary, as you said. Their use of different alliances. It's interesting that you mentioned the Quad, but of course now this last week, in the case of Latin America. And you have stood bold, especially Qatar. You have stood bold when the times went wrong. Qatar was, of course, attacked, but Qatar was also criticized for somehow being in bed with Hamas, which was never the case. Qatar has stood firm to the principles of international mediation. The second aspect of that, you mentioned it, and I would like to insist on it, is that, of course, I would say this, and I do believe it, but it's still necessary for the NGOs, the professionals, the people like us. I'm the only non-doctor on this panel, by the way, but I still claim some rights, that who know a thing or two about empathy, about the behavioral aspects of mediation. But we don't bring leverage. You do. And so a partnership and alliance between us is absolutely essential. And it's happening. And you mentioned it yourself, and I see it growing. I also think that for people like us in the unofficial world, while track one mediation is not an essential part of our toolbox, advising parties to government, Syria is a great example these days, one of the few parts of the world which is actually going through a period of transition where it's trying to make the difficult decisions about building peace. Unique globally, and extraordinarily difficult, as we've seen. So we can advise governments, but we need to play partnership together. Lakhdar Brahimi, of sainted memory, he's still alive, but I remember him saying to me a few years ago, he said for HD, he said, you'd never get to do Aceh again these days. We worked on Aceh back in the beginning years of the century. You'd never get there. It's now people like Majid is going to be running Aceh and getting the Nobel, by the way, which happened after Aceh. And we don't resent it. We don't resent it at all. So I think it's changing enormously. And of course, there's a global south, there's a need for inclusion. One of my main experiences in mediation is the absence of inclusion, of my own efforts at mediation, of the absence at the serious business of finding ground truth. In Qatar, you do a lot of this. You bring people here, you talk to civil society, you make it intrinsic to your plan of action and approach. And others do too. It's not just Qatar, but it's the new world, which in the famous words of one of the old prime ministers of my country has come to rescue the sins of the old. It's not that the old is gone. And you mentioned Switzerland, Norway, and others, part of your troop. We hope Uruguay, Thomas is there, will also be part of this new world. It's very exciting. But don't let's lose the precepts of mediation, which include, again, Majed, you mentioned it, which include not just stopping wars, but building peace. You rightly said, look, a ceasefire is not a bad thing. It saves lives. I worked in humanitarian affairs, so I would completely say this. It saves lives. It stops people starving. Alex spoke movingly this week about the issue of starvation as a weapon of war. When the ceasefire in Gaza, which you mediated earlier this year, went through for that first phase, that famous first phase, I was involved in the humanitarian efforts in the UN about that time. And I think it was clear, Alex would know better, that famine was pushed back a bit. Starvation was pushed back a bit, even in those few weeks of access to food and drugs and medicine. A remarkable testament. evidence-based testament to why aid is necessary for survival and peace. So it's a great new world for mediation. Of course, people like me are critical of the way some of it is being transacted. Of course, people in the world look in vain for a sort of a non-polarized world to make it happen. Of course, we look to this region and others, and I'm glad Uruguay is here, for example, to make this world broader. And I know Qatar and others in the region are very interested in that. So I'm very optimistic, and I'm going to go away and get a PhD so I can talk more clearly in the future about what's right and wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for these important points, and especially underlining that even though the kind of norm of political settlement may be eroding, but mediation is still very present and essential and needed. And also the UN's role kind of as a legitimizer, which of course remains essential, but in cooperation with others, both states and then also NGOs. Now, Comfort. How do you see the role of different actors in mediation in the future? And particularly in your 10 Conflicts to Watch report published at the beginning of the year, it is mentioned that, and I quote, for deal making, Trump's heterodoxy might be more an advantage if it is aimed in the right direction. So a secondary question that I have for you is how big of an impact has Trump's deal-making had, not necessarily on mediation as such, but also on the other actors in the mediation field? Or asked differently, has Trump confused us about what mediation is, or is this the future?
How long do you have? First, let me settle Martin's concerns about the PhDs. My father gave me 3 choices, and the PhD was the one that became more apparent. So I did it because of my father, don't worry. Look, when we said that at the start of the year, I mean, the other thing that we said in the 10 Conflicts to Watch was that Trump's iconoclasm and his unorthodox approach might lend an opening to a process, the art of deal making. And so it was in that spirit that we said, you know, it may yield potential openings. And we also said that he would treat both allies and adversaries with the same hand, and he's done that. I'm not saying that we predicted anything, it's just that this was also based on what we saw from Trump 1. I should also make it clear that the difference between myself and all the 3 actors on the stage, and I doff my hat to all of you, is that we are not mediators. We enable a mediation process. We see our role as being in service of mediation. It matters to us. The most important thing for us as a first principle is to sound the alarm very early, is to close the gap between warning early and acting early, which is still, I think, the weakest link as well, but to also arm you with what we consider to be a full understanding of a conflict. So we listen to all sides of the conflict, and we try to capture the dilemmas of all the actors in the conflict and try to come up with some options. Some of those options, some of those policies are ahead of the curve, or they meet the moment, or they are maybe provocative. That's the essence of crisis group. And so we see ourselves as being in service of the, quite frankly, very difficult task. And we're not Pollyanna-ish about that. We put our ideals at the door and deal with the reality. And it's in that spirit that we wrote those 10 conflicts, that for us, the path to get into peace is not easy. We will not, however, undermine or sell off mediation, so we're pretty principled. But the path to get in there requires you to do things maybe differently and to think differently. And sometimes the unconventional is often it's not to be snared at as well. So as much as we want to criticize a particular approach, if it helps to silence the guns, even for 5 days, I will take it. For the sake, as you were saying earlier, Dr. Majid, for the sake of that child, for the sake of that family, for the sake of that human person. So we will take it. The task for the rest of us is to make sure that it sticks. That what was signed, sometimes in bad faith, that what was signed in pencil becomes iron, becomes that we see the Mont Blanc of the pen being added to it by you. So I just want to put ourselves in the category of where we see ourselves in this community of actors. And I hope that we continue to play that role as humbly as we can. But deal making is sometimes what you need. If you'd spoken to me a year ago, I would not imagine the outcome we're seeing in Syria today. So let's also be frank. If you spoke to me 6 months ago, I would not have imagined what happened with Gaza. And it was a horror show. So we needed to find a way in which to get there, and Qatar was instrumental in it is also. If you'd spoke to us a year ago, we would not have imagined what we're seeing right now in the Great Lakes. And by the way, fighting is still going on. Despite what we saw in the White House, fighting is still going on. So you do need to play the long game. The patient capital is required. This quick, kind of like theatrical performance, maybe you need that. But the key for us is who's behind the scenes, who's right behind the theatrics, the reality TV, the performance that you're seeing, who's right behind that to make sure that you continue to do the hard work so you don't see what we've seen in the last 30 years, because sometimes we paint the last 30 years as a glorious moment of peacemaking and peacekeeping, that you don't see entrenched, intractable conflicts, because quite frankly, the DRC has been going on for much of my lifetime, Martin. And now we're watching what's happening in the Sahel, which has been abandoned, and look what's happened in Sudan. We all thought we were onto something in 2019. But the key actors who are vital to making sure that you unlock the process and that you accompany those who were given the burden of trying to secure a peace deal, they weren't given that support, which is why we're here today, as we are. Meredith can tell this story better than I did, that it was such an uneven landscape. So the burden of delivering peace was given to a cast of characters that neither had the revenue, they neither had the political support, they neither had the support of the international community to help shape the peace. And you wonder why we got to April 2023, when the process was so uneven, that you were asking civilians to deliver in the face of entrenched military and security actors who had the levers of powers in their hand. So if you don't want us to come back here next year, we've got to think about how we piece this together. And to your point, Dr. Majid, and I'm glad you said it, it's not a beauty contest. There are different actors that are necessary in weaving the process together. And we all have to understand our role in that process. You all have to understand that at each moment in the process, a particular actor or actors are involved. They all have different interests, they all have different stakes, and it's how to keep them at the table. And yes, we have to mediate the mediators sometimes, because in today's day and age, all those actors have a stake in the conflict. That is the story of Sudan as well. You asked about the 10 conflicts to watch. I won't predict what's in the 10 conflicts for next year. Safe to say, it's not a predictive tool. It's not trying to predict the future, but it's simply asking you to watch certain conflicts for various reasons. And one of them, Martin, to speak to your point, is about the human cost of conflict, which quite frankly is going in the wrong direction as well. And it's quite devastating that we're seeing wars rising, we're seeing humanity and the lack of compassion and empathy. We talked about this earlier with Dr. Majid is what also worries us going forward. But thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you really tied everything nicely together in terms of kind of the mediation process and all the different phases being needed. So also deal making as an opportunity to opening doors, to stop the violence, and then maybe also others and the longer term process to then build peace in the long term. But also when you said, you know, it's not a beauty contest in the sense that, you know, all the actors are actually needed, all the efforts are needed, all the mediators are needed in this world to actually solve the conflicts peacefully, address them peacefully, and solve them in the longer term. I would like to open it up now for questions from the audience. I will take 3 questions at a time, and then I will give it back to the panel. The first one, Meredith, please.
Thank you very much. This is such an interesting panel and such an optimistic panel, which I love to hear. But I would love it if you could all reflect on the challenge of competition. That when we're in a moment of multilateral crisis, which we were just speaking about in the other room, how do you, when you don't get along, when you don't have the same interests, when you don't even necessarily have the same analytical framing of where the conflict has come from and the objectives of peace, when you have actors involved in the peacemaking who are also parties to the conflict, what systems can we be putting into place in the midst of this crisis of multilateralism to address this competition? And Dr. Majid, I'd be particularly interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sayed Moaz Shah from the Geneva Graduate Institute. Thank you, Sarah. Your words, Dr. Majid, we met last year as well, and I think they echoed the importance where conflict, majority of the conflict that's registered internally or through external forces is in the Muslim world, unfortunately. And where that conversation actually needs to be anchored in states like Qatar taking that initiative, and others, of course, in supporting roles. But I think that's something that I'm happy that you echoed. But Martin, you mentioned Chris in a very fond light as well, and I do acknowledge the very important work, obviously, humanitarian is. But just in the session before this one, he mentioned how humanitarian aspect is now being considered a card in the conversation of mediation negotiation. And that is demonstrating a deterioration of the situation. And you know, you spoke about Gaza and the ceasefire, but if we look at the ceasefire now, Amnesty International just put out a report 2 weeks ago suggesting that genocidal intent is still going based on starvation, with 6,500 tons of aid still being blocked and half the essential medicines being depleted and 16,000 people. We can go down the list of the evidence of that. But you know, the ICJ made a ruling as well on this specific issue. So how do we actually preserve that holy sanctity of humanitarian aid that shouldn't be sacrificed in such conversations? I think that's the challenge, so if you could have your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Erin?
Thank you for provoking us. Erin McCandless from the Qatar South Africa Center for Peace in University of Johannesburg. And both Chris and Comfort, you mentioned deal making and that you think we have to engage it now and that it has some promise of some kind, or that you're at least not afraid of it. So my question is about sustainability, addressing root causes, which we also have some kind of policy consensus around as being critical to sustaining peace. So what happens if deal making directly conflicts with what we know to be needed for addressing root causes, what societies know they need? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the questions. So challenging questions that will challenge the panelists a little bit. So the challenge of competition, so how to deal with competition when there's not a unity of purpose. Then this question about the politicization of humanitarian aid, plus the kind of tension between deal making and sustainable peace. Chris, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. I'll start with Aaron. So, Aaron, it is what we have, right? And I'm a pragmatic person, so I'm not saying I love it, but it's what we have. And in some cases, we've also seen that it has managed to get unstuck some conflicts that we have been struggling with in our conventional methods for years. So it won't address root causes. It won't. You can actually also win a war militarily, but that doesn't, you can't win the peace. And that, to Comfort's comments earlier also, like that long term, but that's where I see the opportunity. You know, Berghoff is an NGO. We won't solve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, obviously. I mean, you need big power players for that. But that's why I'm talking about this sort of cohesion, collaboration, which then, to Meredith's question about competition, and I'm assuming you're not meaning NGO competition here, you're meaning big state competition. But yeah, I do see that as a real problem. I mean, look at Sudan. While the Quad is discussing where it should be a quint or not, you know, we have our insider mediators in Sudan trying to do local ceasefires and surviving the day. And yeah, I think that's a problem. And that, again, how do we mediate the mediators? And who has the leverage? And again, I mean, I am a child of, as many of us in this room, I think we are a lot of people sort of post-1989 worldview of how we engage with conflict. And, you know, my generation, we grew up with this belief in the UN. And, you know, I won't attack, Asif, I'm not going to attack you here. So, but no, but again, I think you all remember Jan Eliasson. And he always said, I grew up with him, he always said, if we didn't have the UN, you know, no chance we would invent it today. So it is what we have. And it's what we do with it. We are UN, honestly. So in terms of legitimacy, I think maybe, again, if the UN could then mediate the mediators, that would be good. But I mean, I'll pass it on to Dr. Majid, because I'm sure he will have a better answer from his perspective.
I mean, that was perfect, because at the end, the main problem you have, I mean, there are two types of competition, and let's start with this. There's competition that has to do with regionalizing conflict, in the sense that you have actors that act as mediators, but they have a vested interest in the conflict itself. And therefore, they're using mediation as a bit of a Trojan horse, where they have their own interests. They want one party or the other to have the upper hand, but they are still part of the mediation one way or the other. We're seeing this happen more and more in mediations today. You know, I mentioned some of them. I won't go into detail, but it's very problematic, because I don't think it is conducive to peace when one of the parties that is mediating has a preference on who gets the better outcome of that mediation. I mean, doesn't need even one to say it. But the problem is, in at least 3 mediations I know about and you know about, you know, sponsors of one of the parties is sitting there in the mediation room. But keeping them out means they will be the saboteurs of mediation. And therefore, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If you bring them into the room, you know that they will be saboteurs in the room. If you keep them out of the room, they will be saboteurs outside of it. So that's one type of mediation. The other type of competition, sorry. The other type of competition, which is much milder, is the competition over the Nobel Prizes, right? The prestige, the media moment, the announcement. I mean, I won't say the countries, but 2 countries, you know, predominantly European countries, their representatives met with me on different occasions, and it was very clear that each one of them came with his capital with the message that you shouldn't work with the other guys, you should work with us. We have more experience in this, and we have more experience with that. That's much nicer competition to work with, right? Especially for the party that's being, you know, approached by both sides. But it is a problem. One of the main reasons why you see a lot of deals being signed in the White House is because a lot of the mediators decided that you can utilize the prestige-seeking, you know, model in the White House today to your advantage. You can go to the White House, you can get American approval on the deal, you can get a commitment behind the deal, and you can use that leverage in making sure that the agreement stands. Not necessarily a bad thing. This is the kind of utility of interest that needs to be in that. And just very quickly on root causes. I mean, I don't think we should be idealistic here, and I don't think anybody in the room here is under any delusion that any conflict that you have seen in the decades past, we addressed all the root causes and there is no chance for conflict to get back. But making sure that our work as mediators, as peace facilitators, does not actually exacerbate the root causes is what we need to focus on. One of the parameters we use in choosing mediations, which we get involved with, or to continue these mediations, is are we actually, through the mediation, helping solve or complicate the crisis? Because in a lot of these instances, you are being used by both or one of the parties in order to prolong the conflict or to delay the resolution of the conflict long enough for them to be able to get back and do it in an even worse way. So we need to keep in our minds how to utilize or how to work with root causes. And here I want to applaud the work of the ICG and other organizations where they jump in when our interest is not so much after we sign the deal and we get the pictures. When governments are done with the political announcements, this is when NGOs and other parties go in and start addressing the root cause. It's very difficult to address the root cause while guns are being fired. It's much easier to do it during ceasefires. And finally, Martin, you're not a dinosaur, because dinosaurs are prehistoric and you're a historic figure.
Where I am not a dinosaur. Let my wife hear this, please. Let this be streamed. Thanks, Majid. I want to talk about the Chris Lockyer problem. As if I was nice to him, yeah. It's absolutely right. Humanitarian community, MSF particularly, is suffering a great deal from the fact that they are not in the case of the things that you're doing, Majid, or in the case of the things that Comfort you're advising on, but in the case of many conflicts where they are alone. And it is politicized. And one of the worries about the concept of humanitarian diplomacy, which we have seen discussed here this week, and which I am a great supporter of, is that, and we've talked about this a lot, that in my view, humanitarian diplomacy includes mediation. And it has all the risks that others have described. What's missing now, I think, in humanitarian action, and this is not about mediation, it's not about peacemaking, is the renewal of that compact, which got us here over these 65 years or so forth. You know, I started one of my humanitarian jobs in Save the Children Fund, which of course was born after the Second World War and the return of children to their homes, and was part of that original liberal, wonderful, positive ambition to serve people well. And we've lost it. And it's revealed in lack of funding, and it's revealed in lack of access, it's revealed in the impunity, and staggeringly, for me, I think this is true, the enormous numbers of humanitarian aid workers who are routinely killed, it's not just Gaza, but they're the worst, goes unpunished, goes largely unpunished. And even the employers of those humanitarian aid workers, you know, responsible to their families for pursuing the perpetrators, have great difficulties in doing so. Let's be honest, because it also, makes their own operations vulnerable. It's an extraordinary crime, and it's not the worst of crimes, but it's one in our community. It's an extraordinary crime which doesn't even bear much discussing these days. You've lost a lot of people, UNRWA, of course, and it goes on and on and on. And we turn a blind eye to it in order to keep working. And we turn a blind eye, we try, in humanitarian organizations, to turn a blind eye to the extraordinary cuts in aid and the extraordinary evidence, which is evidence, of the impact on lost lives, for example, in Africa as a result of the US cuts. That's a crime. It's a crime. And it has impact in dead people. So I think the humanitarian agencies are suffering terribly at the moment, worse than ever. Just the obsession that they have to have with cuts is bad enough, but the obsession that they do have with deaths and with consequences is shocking. But they are the first, and this is important, they are the first, as I said earlier, to want wars to end, because they see the consequences first. I did a lot of advocacy when I was in the UN on the humanitarian work on Gaza. And I did so because our colleagues, you and others, were in the front line seeing truths every day. You didn't have to make it up. We weren't doing some prestidigitation. We were talking about the ground truth that we knew. And we had the obligation to talk about it. As a result, I haven't been to Israel since, or to Gaza, ever. But it's a shame. On competition, can I make one issue on competition? I actually agree with Majid very much that, and we know the sort of conflicts we're talking about where leverage from both sides, or from different sides, is brought together to try to end a conflict. And I agree with it. I think it makes it very difficult for the mediators, because traditionally we think of them have common interests, but they don't. And you don't have it in the Gaza thing, do you? You have different interests from some of your co-mediators, but they're necessary. And in the case of Sudan, we needed to see that change. And I think it's important. And one final point on ceasefires and building peace. By the way, like Mr. Trump, with whom I largely associate myself, I also didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize because I was involved in Aceh in HD, and it was taken over by a very, very effective grabber of peace processes. No, I'm not going to say that. You were working for them at the time, Itonde. Marty Ahtisaari is a great man. He got a Nobel Peace Prize for Aceh. We suffered, and this is my point, because we brought in a ceasefire which actually took things backwards. A ceasefire is an act in a war. It does great things, but it actually may often have negative consequences. And I worry about Gaza, obviously, in this case, because once again, we've seen the first phase work, which is great, but we haven't seen the second phase work, and we've seen this movie earlier this year. So I think a combination of leverage is crucial, and I think it's creative that it's happening. It makes things much more difficult, and it yields odd results, but don't do things casually in ending wars, because they bite you. Thank you.
Thank you. Comfort.
I mean, just on that last point, Martin, I think what's worrying for a lot of people who are watching Gaza, that you may see a situation of no war, no peace, and that you never quite get past phase one. So I think which is what I mean about you can strike a deal, it's what happens after, and the careful choreography that's going to be needed to cajole both sides this is when it matters as well. So, and this is where it's a different set of actors. Yes, keeping the US in is going to be crucial, but it's going to be the pressure, by the way, that the Gulf countries also put to bear with a combination of other actors, European countries as well, was also vital to getting us towards the Sharm el-Sheikh. And now that the real work starts today. In every piece of crisis group's work, we outline what we see as a combination of factors that led to a conflict, that are driving a conflict. So I work on the assumption, but I'm also open to criticism, that we try to, as far as possible, tell the story of why countries are at conflict, what is driving that conflict and what is sustaining it, and in piecing together an outcome to that, it's very hard to ignore the grievance as well. So it's part and parcel of an inevitable peace plan as well. What is different today, and we've seen it in a lot of conflicts, is that the era of comprehensive peace deals is no longer in vogue as well. So that the last one, and it's good, Dr. Majid, to see your role in Colombia for example, because that was a crucial one. I was in the Philippines, and that's the other last significant peace deal in the Bangsamoro, and that too is on fragile grounds as well. And you are being urged to get involved in that process to make sure it doesn't unravel. And the difference between Colombia and Philippines is it didn't have the wealth of international sort of actors. It did have some NGOs playing a very discreet role and shining a spotlight on what effectively has been a sort of unforgotten or untold story as well. It's nice to be told we're being optimistic, Meredith. It's a very rare label for me to be. Normally people see as crisis group as the Green Reapers, so it's nice to be told that we're slightly optimistic as well. I do not pretend for a second the magnitude of the challenge in front of us today. I'm going to be on a fireside chat later with Alex Duval, and there will be at one point a reckoning between us that says we are talking to you at an age of mass expulsion, of displacement, of crimes and war crimes, of famine, of weaponization. I could go down that route, but I also want to leave the door open that I do see that despite some of the imagery that we're seeing, I guess my job and the task for all of us is how we use this opportunity of the deal making, or whatever you want to call it. How do we use it as a moment in which to drive a wedge through to get to the end goal of trying, again, I said, we've been at war in Sudan. I've lost how many decades that we've lost generations in Sudan. As I speak to you, West Africa is going in the wrong direction. This was the poster child of multilateralism on the continent, and it is in a bad shape. So I will take any deal. And the question, the challenge for all of you who are mediators is how you step in to fill the void. Because those are deals that are pretty vague. I think most of us who were watching Gaza knew that some of the details were vague. And by the way, the careful pressure and the choreography that a number of countries played to get the Security Council engaged and to internationalize the process, and not to leave it as an Americanized one, but to internationalize it, puts pressure both on President Trump, but also on all the key actors to say that the international community has to own this. If it's going to work, everybody is in it, and it's going to be a push-pull factor as well. So we all acknowledge and we all recognize what it was. But even to get the Security Council, seriously, that was a hard effort, especially when you consider just how dysfunctional the Security Council is today, when you see the great power tussle that has taken place, that we were able to pull out of it a resolution and even get the United States to even work within that framework isn't itself a remarkable achievement. And I don't think we should underestimate the work that a number of countries played very quietly to nudge the US to get that resolution through the door as well. And the key now is how you sustain that. And as the Prime Minister said himself on the opening day of the Doha Forum, it will be an indictment on everybody that we can't get from phase 1 to phase 2, and ultimately to what is the heart of the matter, the rights of Palestinian statehood. That is the fundamental outcome in this process. And the road to that process is going to be very, very difficult as well.
Thank you very much. So we have time for another round of questions. Itonde, you were very insisting before, so I want to give you the floor. And I have you.
Thank you. Sarah, sorry if my raising of the hand appeared as insistent, simply to make sure you saw my hand. Let me just start by expressing deep appreciation for multiple reasons for this space. The number one, of course, to the Doha Forum, to our colleagues here for the leadership. because I think it reflects a very rare space at the moment. And even I'm looking at this panel in light of what you were saying, Dr. Majid, it reflects something very interesting for me in terms of skill sets, expertise, history, etc., that perhaps paints a picture for what is required as well in nudging forward some efforts. On arrival here, I flew from Geneva Friday morning. The plane was absolutely full. And you're smiling. And full of many individuals in this room. I think it's really fascinating to see how many institutions from Geneva, principles of organizations, humanitarian, peace, development, are here in Doha. And I'm not sure what that means, apart from the possibilities of extraordinary complementarity, but also a desire to see this commitment that you've described be a sustaining factor in the hard work of advancing sustainable peace. Martin, I see you in so many ways, as I'm sure many do, as a doyen in mediation, from dinosaur to doyen. Not a doctor. But I mention this because many aspects of your career in mediation or humanitarian diplomacy have also emanated from Geneva. And we're talking about venues and the qualities of venues, the politics of venues in peacemaking, Doha representing something really powerful at the moment in a way that is already painting a historical shift. Attractiveness, not exclusively, but presenting new ways, new pathways. What does that mean for the future of peacemaking? I'm very eager to hear this in light of how many of us cooperate together. Let me end there, but actually I must thank you, sir. You said something very profound. When you were reflecting on the ways in which Qatar is approaching mediation, you then moved into saying all this infrastructure that's been built up, expertise, it's part of the approach to sustain that, to invest in this. Many of us feel that and we don't take it for granted because the chaos of the world coupled with the chaos of drastic policy shifts is not good for peacemaking. So having steady partners in that regard is fundamentally crucial.
Thank you very much. You can give the word.
Thank you very much, Nomi Bayakov, Geneva Center for Security Policy. I would like first and foremost to thank Qatar for the mediation, exceptional mediation work that they've been doing painstakingly for so long with a long-term vision, with a lot of patience, a huge amount of resilience, and I have a huge amount of respect for all of you, but for His Excellency, Dr. Majid al-Ansari in the case, and of course the Prime Minister and the Emir in the case of Gaza. And my specific question is about the chaos that we are seeing at the moment post Sharm, you know, we call it like the family photo, okay? So how are we going to deal with the implementation of the 20 points when there are so many bodies involved in where each and every point requires so much, I use the term again, painstaking work, and so many different bodies dealing with it. Qatar is continuing to lead. Turkey has had a very constructive role in ensuring that the ceasefire actually happens. Egypt clearly on the front line in the US, the only country in the world that Israel depends on existentially and has that leverage. So the question is, who has the leverage and influence over the US so as to ensure that Israel abides by it, and how, by the agreement, which we all know is open to interpretation, otherwise it wouldn't have passed. So key question is a general question in transition of how do we ensure coordination, and specifically in this case, His Excellency, how do we move forward given the time isn't on our side and the trajectory at the moment is not particularly bright, and we need to ensure that that's the trajectory. And last but not least, since there are a lot of people in this room and watching this, what can each and every individual in this room do? Because I do profoundly believe that each and every one of us has a role to play in ensuring that the world moves from chaos to stability and ultimately peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last question, over there.
I'm Isak Svensson from Uppsala University. Thank you so much for hosting us here, and thank you for a fantastic panel. I learned a lot. I would like to ask about the use of deal making and how we can instrumentally use deal making. And I understand the logic of using sort of, if we break down the deal making, we can use the economic emphasis, we can use the short-termness, we can use its leverage, its prestigeness, and I understand that. But what about the unprincipled approach? The fact that it's in contradictory with the UN Charter, with the fundamental norms of not taking over territory by force. And how can that be sort of reconciled with mediation? Or do we need both to incorporate and push back on this transactional approach? Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. I make an exception. I take very last question from you because you have the microphone.
Yeah, thank you.
No, sorry. The lady in the front. Yeah, she was waiting for a long time.
I guess. It's not my lucky day, I guess, because I have taken the type. Very quickly, thank you all. Thank you for the whole panelist. Thank you, Martin, because we're sharing the same worry about the second phase of Gaza. But I guess, like Israel right now, putting all the mediation around the world in very, very big challenge, and mashallah, Qatar and all the mediators did a great work in the mediation, but there is victims in the middle when we're talking about the competition, Dr. Majid, while you're mentioning about the competition in mediation. So in such a case, especially for the second phase and the third phase of the mediation in Gaza, what we're looking or waiting until now, and I'm very worried about a very specific point, especially if we see a case like Gaza and Israel, which is not very optimistic about the upper hand. Right now, we saw that Israel forces all the terms that they wanted to, and no one going to pay the penalties. So in this case, how we are making penalties for countries or occasions like Gaza. And the second thing, we saw the huge efforts of UN in the case of Gaza, but I think right now the whole world we are watching a new era, and I guess the total approach, it has to be changed, especially that we don't see anyone who was punished or had for 74 years or 78 years of the Palestinian cause. Israel never punished, even with the ICJ. They didn't do anything. So what we're looking for right now for the UN, a new face, if we can say. And the last thing,
very quickly.
Who's gonna compensate the people who are victims of all these cases? And this is the role of the mediators to take on, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna give the floor back to the panelists to address the questions. You have not so much time left, but I still want to give you the floor, and I want to add an additional challenge for you, since this panel is on the future of mediation. If you had to tell us in 1 or 2 words, like a hashtag, what is the future of mediation? What would that word be?
Hashtag Qatar.
Hashtag Qatar. So we have, thank you, Chris.
I'll be super brief because I can't answer everything. But honestly, we have more conflicts ongoing now than since World War II. It's just terrifying, and people are dying every day. Yet financing for the peace building sector is going down, almost equivalent to how much Europe is now spending on defense and you know, in hopes of deterrence. And one would have thought we'd learned better. So when you say, Dr. Majid, that you still want to invest in this, and we are then looking towards other actors who actually believe in what we do and who believe that there is more than deal making, because honestly, it's the only way forward with empathy and to be there in the long run and to get even our European states to backtrack and not to believe that deterrence is the only game in town, to actively engage in saving human lives.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you. I'll start with maybe a controversial answer to the question from the gentleman from Uppsala University. Can I just suggest that we have never been principled about conflict resolution? Principled about conflict resolution. In many of these conflicts, double standards, half-cooked solutions, political bargaining were the main elements for coming up with a deal. Yes, we have these principles, they're written in a very nice way in the Charter and other places, but we haven't seen, I think, to this point, only maybe in very minimal cases, where we have seen what we can call a principled. I don't think what we have right now is a collapse of principled mediation and conflict resolution. What we have is a more honest way of describing what the states were doing. Very quickly on what we can do as individuals. I think it's important to realize two things. One, we cannot leave this to the powers that be. Conflict cannot be left to the powers that be. We have to be the powers that will be. And finally, of course, using a very easy buzzword, AI. So we're working in Qatar, for example, on a model right now on how to use AI to help with the back office work of mediation. But that is a very small aspect, of course. But I think it's very important for us to utilize that and see how we can use it in scenario building, in developing options, developing ideas, developing the narrative, collecting data, and that was used in the humanitarian sector very successfully in impact analysis, for example. That kind of thing I think is very important for the future of mediation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Martin.
AI, I know I'm on the dinosaur end of this panel. One of the consequences of the flight from Geneva, I mean literally flight, but the flight of lots of people coming here from Geneva was that I couldn't get a seat on that Friday. So it was very telling. I sneaked in just a little earlier to lay my traps. I want to talk to that point. And we've talked about it a lot at Tonde. And Majid knows this, and we all know this, that one of the burdens on Qatar, and as you said, Majid, at the beginning, the sort of new mediators, and it's of course a crass term, but it also has reality for all of us, is to extend that embrace globally. To extend that embrace globally. I know that Switzerland, Norway, and others, the previous mediators, still very active, are very much in favor of this, and you have framework agreements between them, and you've worked with them recently. And that's why I mentioned Uruguay as a country in Latin America which is coming forward on there. We need to see, obviously, and you're talking to a lot of the countries in Asia on that front. The hub in this region, which is so shocked by conflict, to bring in the world and its talents and its hopes and its energy, is also another burden on you. And I know you grasp it very clearly and very honestly and very helpfully. I want to make one other point, which is about ICG and its competition. The great thing about ICG, apart from Comfort, Dr. Comfort, as we now know her. Hashtag Comfort. I don't even know what a hashtag is. Don't start me on this. Is that you don't have competition. I know there are lots of policy think tanks, probably everybody in this room is part of this, but you don't. And it's remarkable. And I know that you, Comfort, and your colleagues, way back 20, 25 years ago, talked a lot about going into mediation. I remember being at one of your retreats back in those days in France, and you decided not to. You decided to do what you said at the beginning, which was to aid in this dispassionate way that you do, all of us. And the fact that your approach is also to dissect the comparative advantages. Dr. Majid, you've been talking about it in the case of the Gaza plan, of course, it's very vivid, about the benefit of the deal, the benefit of life saved, and the massive effort that then goes into going to phase 2, if I could put it that way, aided by you. So it's a good thing that you don't have that competition. And we all rely, I think, on ICG, and we have done for decades, for honesty and direction and guidance. And I think it's a story that we need to see elsewhere. ICG favors us all. You, Majid, here and in this region favors us all. I'm looking at Humaid. Of course, Oman has been doing this for many, many years. The NGO community in conflict resolution is not actually fabled for combinations and cooperation. It is a competitive environment because of various reasons. But I think, Editonde, you're a leader on this, we are moving towards it. And it's a good thing. And you're helping, and you're helping. So I remain #something
Thank you
optimist dinosaur.
Thank you very much. Comfort.
I don't have anything else to add but to say thank you, Martin, but also to everybody, because, you know, crisis group is as good as you allow us to be, and that we safeguard the confidentiality that you provide to us, and our integrity is contingent on that, on being confidential to that as well. So thank you very much for your kind words as well. So, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and please join me in a big round of applause for them. Thank you.